very, very warm welcome to you all this afternoon. Welcome to our alumni, welcome to our friends from around the world. We have 38 nationalities signed up alphabetically from Australia to Vietnam. This is today's Bringing Birmingham to You event organized through our alumni office. And our aim is to share the latest research from, in this case, the School of Education with you all to explain what we've been doing, how we have been really getting deeply into our topic this afternoon, which is the impact of COVID-19 on education. I really can't think of a more important topic for us to look at. If you read the literature, it is sometimes described as a black swan event. And a black swan event is one of those fortunately very rare events that impacts on the economy, on health, on all aspects of society, and of course, on education. Here in the UK, we have different domains, of course, delegated powers between England, Scotland, and Wales, and so forth. But all of the nations, the children have missed more than 100 days education, and they are now in their third year of interruption. We've seen a huge gap emerging, for example, between those who attend independent schools and state schools. That's 4%, 96% respectively, when you analyze the amount of online learning, particularly during lockdown 1. We know that COVID has exposed the digital divide, and I guess that's a kind of proxy for wider socioeconomic gaps. All of this has led to a significant learning loss. A lot of people are looking at that in detail at the moment. Certainly, all of my education leadership students are looking at exactly what's happened in terms of patterns of learning since the pandemic impacted on us. And we know that there's been a significant change in terms of the role of schools themselves. Broadly speaking here, that's been a widening of role and greater engagement with the community. And at home, for parents, carers, young people, students, a very great change in how we have been learning. And we know that technology's left forward probably 10 years in a matter of 18 months or so. So what I'm going to do now is ask the panel to introduce themselves, and then I will put our questions on the table for discussion. So first of all, if I can start, I'm going to go around my screen. Here we are. So Karen, could you introduce yourself, please, first?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Colin. My name's Karen Goldberg, and I'm Professor in Autism Studies here at the University of Birmingham. I'm the Director of the Autism Centre for Education and Research, and I'm also Head of Department of Disability Inclusion and Special Needs. And some of the recent research I've been engaging with in the last couple of years has been on the exclusion of autistic children and young people from education. That's been focusing particularly on England. And we've also looked at the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on families with children with autistic children and young people. And more recently, we're engaged in a project looking at the experiences of marginalized families and what we can do better in research and education to support those families. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Julie.
Thanks, Colin, and hello, everyone. We are hoping that we will pop up on your screens eventually, but this is no bad thing to have us behind the screens at the moment. I'm Julie Allen, and I'm Professor of Equity and Inclusion at the University of Birmingham School of Education. And until August 2020, some 6 months into the pandemic, was head of the School of Education at the university. I'm also a governor of the University of Birmingham School. And since the start of 2021, I've been leading a research project called Digital, Diversifying Inclusion and Growth, Inspiring Technologies for Accessible Learning in the Time of COVID, which is funded by the YTL Foundation in Malaysia. And together with Francesca Peruzzo, and working in close collaboration with Beth and Maurice Tran, who's on the panel today, we've looked at the response to the pandemic in 6 countries: the UK, the USA, Australia, Malaysia, Chile, and Italy.
Julie, thank you very much. And final member of our panel, your name's just been mentioned there. Bethan, please introduce yourself.
Hi to everyone on the webinar. My name's Bethan and I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham. So my PhD research is focusing on how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected education, specifically looking at the mental well-being of students and teachers. I'm doing that through looking at it in terms of a global perspective. So I'm looking at responses to the pandemic and educational responses across 4 different countries, and that includes the UK, the USA, Vietnam, and New Zealand.
Thank you very much, Bethan, and welcome to you all. So I'm going to put our exam questions on the table now. A reminder to everybody out there, I can see some great conversations going on about reflecting life when you were students with us here in Birmingham, quoting many happy evenings in Moseley. Great, keep all of that coming, please. So panel, I have 4 questions for you to discuss, please, in the next half hour or so. First of all, how can we close the education equality gaps that have been widened by the pandemic? Secondly, children's well-being. How can we balance what's called catching up on schoolwork primarily with recovery and restoration? So catch up versus recovery. Thirdly, what positives can parents and educators take away from the last 18 months? There certainly are some out there. And finally, how can we as researchers do better at reaching marginalized families? So there are our questions, and everyone out there has heard them now. So this is working without camera here. Karen, would you like to kick off, please?
I can indeed. Okay, I think the first point that I would like to make, and I'm sure that we'll build on this point as we go, is when we talk about the education inequality gaps, we also need to look at the broader gaps in society, and those are rooted very much in broader inequalities. And one of the inequalities I just wanted to highlight to start off the discussion was really the inequalities around economic situation. If you look at Department for Education figures, for example, in England, and I think we will find similar situations in many, many countries, given that over 1.5 billion school children have been excluded from education at different times during the pandemic, and there have been school closures in 165 countries. In every single one of those countries, there is an economic impact that goes with the pandemic. And in Department for Education figures in England, for example, families of children with autism, and it's very similar figures for children more broadly with special educational needs, the families that were eligible for free school meals in England, for example, rose from 28%, just over 28% in 2019 to 2020, from 28% up to over 32% in 2020 to 21. And there is an even bigger gap there in inequalities for children who have special educational needs, because the whole school population, those that were eligible for free school meals, rose from 17%, just over 17%, to just over 20%. So there's an additional financial burden on families who have children with disabilities. In fact, there's around about an 11% difference just by looking at that one metric alone. So I think it's very important to start off with the recognition that education inequality is part of a bigger story about inequality in society more generally. But I'm sure the other panelists would like to build on that. But anecdotally, in our discussions and our feedback and interviews with different families, We're finding increasing numbers of families where people are living in hostels, in houses of multiple occupancy. We are hearing a lot of stories about whole families sofa surfing, as they call it. And we are finding that more families are in low paid occupations and on 0-hour contracts. So it's really important for us to understand that broader social impact when we're trying to address how we can bridge the gaps in education.
Indeed, indeed. And sofa surfing is something that might be fun when you are an undergraduate or perhaps even a postgrad, but certainly not if you're trying to look after a family. So we get the picture there. So I am going to pull you back later to, so when we've got this picture which is emerging about, you know, the relationship between education and broader societal disadvantage, we will need to come back to what can we do to close those gaps? But let's stay on this theme of what we're seeing out there right now. Julie and Bethan, would you like to embellish that picture, please?
Yes, I'd like to add to what Karen says and maybe start to address the gap question actually by not addressing it, but I'll come to that in a moment. And the pandemic has certainly widened the gap between those already disadvantaged and other students, creating what UNICEF has called double jeopardy, whereby those already behind are left further behind. And Save the Children has referred to the toxic mix of poverty and discrimination that leads to exclusion, because individuals are a girl, a refugee from an ethnic minority, or a child with a disability. And again, that's been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. I actually think that rather than talking about gaps and trying to close these, we should be doing what the American Gloria Ladson-Billings tells us, which is to think about debts rather than gaps. So debts are the things we owe our children as a result of this pandemic and all the things that have gone before that have created inequalities. So we have educational debts, but we also have economic debts through the poor resourcing of schools, especially those serving disadvantaged students. We have socio-political debts with the exclusion of disadvantaged groups. And we have moral debts, which is the disparity between what we know to be the right thing and what we're actually doing. So I prefer debts rather than gaps.
Julie, thanks. That is an interesting concept, and it certainly pushes the responsibility back to those who are, you know, who have the power, the levers in society. Already people are saying in chat line, well, I hope we're going to bring these facts and these issues to the new education secretary in England. I'm sure we can do that. So thank you for that, Julie. We're setting the scene here. Bethan, what are you seeing out there?
I think really similar to, you know, both Julie and Karen. The pandemic is, I think, obviously, in my opinion, just highlighted that we already have quite a lot of existing problems in society. And so I think the reason that the attainment gap is obviously grown to be, you know, a really big focus, especially now in our educational agendas, is that it's been compounded, similarly to what Julie and both Karen have said, from bigger overarching processes that are really the problems of different things in society. I mean, there's a great quote by Ray, who's a sociologist at Cambridge, where she talks about how schools are basically expected to kind of almost correct and make up for the shortcomings in society. And schools already do so much of that. I mean, from the fact that, you know, so many kids, you know, rely on them for free school meals, and, you know, parents and families rely on them for childcare. But it's this kind of question of where do we draw the line? And I think obviously the reason we have this attainment gap is because society is imperfect, and for us to, I think, look at how to close that, it would require a lot more kind of like cross-sector cooperation to address all of the problems that we already have, because like Julie said, and Karen, it's not just one issue, but it's it's the racial and the economic and the class advantages that our society already kind of has compounded and loaded in some people's favor. And so to address that, it would require looking at all of those, but I think also on a personal level, because we're all part of that system. And so when we, like I say, by attending events like this and educating ourselves and looking at why things are the way they are and what has made them this way, it starts to help us, see our own biases and realize how we can start addressing them and what work needs to be done for it. So.
Indeed. So stay there, Beth, and keep your mic on, please. So you quite rightly said that, look, schools can't be expected to correct, that's the word you use, shortcomings in society. And a lot of head teachers will be saying, yeah, you know what? Successive governments keep raising the expectations they have on us, certainly in England, and yet at the same time cutting back the resources we have to deal with them. And the local authorities that they are, that they are placed in, also have had resources withdrawn, for example, for children's social care, and health authorities have had funding reduced for child and adolescent mental health and so on. So when you've been doing your research, what kind of examples have you come across where they say, well, okay, this is there are some things here we can't control, but we still have that kind of duty, as it were, to do our best to close those inequality gaps. We have some work to do on catching up and recovery. What are you seeing in terms of proactive measures there, initiatives, innovation, and so on?
Well, I mean, from reading that I've done so far and what's being said in the literature, different countries have had kind of vastly different responses to the pandemic and what things they've prioritized within those responses. I mean, in New Zealand, for example, their response to the pandemic was very obviously swift and decisive, and their strategy to cope with that and mitigate the effects was obviously completely different. And something that they've done differently in their educational response that's actually very fascinating is that they've really taken this priority to focus on mental health, and that's been things like making sure that schools have mental health counselors and things like that are available for students, and also taking particular care to look at the effect on their marginalized groups in society, so the Maori and Pacific students and families and things like that. By contrast, the UK has released a report, the UK government anyway has released a report saying that yes, mental well-being is a priority, but they've not really stated any clear kind of cut plan about how they intend to follow up with this or how they intend to do that. But I think what's been made very clear, one of the few good things to come out of the pandemic is that people are, I think, more willing, and also there's less stigma about talking about mental well-being and being able to be, I think, vulnerable and talk about the problems that we've all faced throughout the pandemic, especially concerning mental health. And so I think in order to focus on, catching up, because that is inevitably what governments will focus on, is that mental health should take precedent, because without this, it puts students and teachers at risk of other things, such as burnout and, more long-term challenges. And so I think by focusing on the mental well-being and working with that in mind from the get-go, it then kind of means that schools can kind of have the right focus to tackling them, and then think, okay, if this takes precedent, we can make reasonable adjustments for other things. Maybe that could be, altering, the curriculum order or content, or using other forms of assessments, or, different things that would be most beneficial for students to have, because by fostering a healthy kind of, mental state and cultivating a good environment for students to learn in, it can only be beneficial for their long-term educational success. And I use success here to mean like continued learning and progress.
Indeed. Yeah, thank you for that. I think certainly looking at the chat line here, there's an appetite for us to think and talk internationally this afternoon. And I think, for those of us based in England, here in Edgbaston, we've had 11 years of education policy now, which has framed the role of schools and the models of learning that have been put forward in a way that's actually narrowed the role of school overall and narrowed the preferred channels. There are certain things that our government has well nigh obsessed on in terms of knowledge-rich curriculum, so-called, and so forth, and direct instruction. I think what we're talking about here is decidedly different, and certainly mental health issues have come to the fore. A number of our colleagues are asking about that in the chat line. Julie, how are you seeing this? Because I mean, mental health, without good mental health as a kind of hygiene factor, the recovery is going to be partial at best.
Indeed, and I'm just seeing in the chat some really important comments from Janet and Caroline that is reminding me of the need to remember teachers in all of this and the enormous expectations that we've placed upon them to see our children through this awful situation. And, I hope we can come back to that. But in our research, we found a lot of schools, when the students were being brought back in, were putting the children's welfare and well-being ahead of academic performance. So just getting children back into school, back to being together, back to socializing, and using all sorts of great and creative things like play, art, and the outdoors to engage children. And some schools were even going so far as to avoid assessing the children right away. So they were being pressed by governments to identify where the children were at so that catch-up could begin. And some schools were saying, nah, we'll be more concerned about children's health, mental health, and mental well-being. And that seemed to us to be really rather sensible.
Yes, quite so. I saw a number of schools where they'd gone, as it were, the full forest school for the summer when the children were back, and a lot of emphasis on outdoor play. We know how important that is for well-being, and this chimes in with one of the questions, particularly about very young children who have missed out on a huge chunk of socializing. We're thinking here of the 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. Almost half their life have been in a form of social isolation. Karen, how are you seeing how our profession in education, our professions in education, are responding, particularly to the very young children's needs?
Yeah, it's interesting because I see that people have been posting comments in the chat there as well, and talking about the fact that in many school leaders are pushing for schools to go back to normal as soon as possible, and people are commenting on the pressures that people have because Ofsted judges schools on academic achievement. And I think what Julie and Bethan were really highlighting was actually the need for us to really back teachers. And I do see a lot of teachers and a lot of schools really pushing for a change in how we see education, for a change in ethos and values, and pushing back against that constant pressure to focus on attainment, because I think there is a broader recognition amongst many teachers that we've spoken to that we need to have an education system that is much more accepting of diversity, that will focus more on creating enabling environments in school in a way which is inclusive and accepting of difference, and that those kind of environments need to really focus on the needs of individual children and young people. They need to give them a voice, a sense of agency in their learning, and they need to be about working in partnership with parents and other professionals. And I think we recognise that we mustn't look at this as a narrow issue of mental health. This is actually an issue about well-being, and well-being needing to be absolutely at the centre of the education endeavour, because if we can't create enabling environments in which we're enhancing well-being, then learning really, really suffers. And I think that's an international issue that we're facing, and it crosses national boundaries, and is an important one for teachers and school staff to really push back on some of the government policies and pressures that come down on us from government. And I do see people pushing back at that. And I think from what Julie and Bethan were both saying, people are pushing back at that in many other countries as well.
Just stay there for a second, Karen, because I'm reading the chat line and listening to you. Somebody's asked here, I think it's from Stu, do we see well-being and academic attainment as opposites or conflicting? And I think sitting under that is something I've been thinking about listening to you about, is there a tension between recovery and catch up, or are they symbiotic? Are they, is one necessary for the other? So is there any kind of conflict built in here between well-being and attainment in the English system?
Well, I think in an ideal world, there shouldn't be a conflict at all, because learning and well-being are closely bound up with each other, aren't they? Learning isn't just about how we take on board information on the cognitive level. It's about how we are motivated, how we engage, how we're emotionally engaged with the subject matter that we're studying. And we do know from research, from a lot of research, that if people have more agency in their learning, they're likely to learn much better and remember facts, especially when there's something that they're really interested in. So I think in the kind of philosophical sense, they are completely symbiotic, but I think in the way that we experience it in the education system, they're often seen as being at tension with one another, because there is often that external pressure and people being judged, teachers being judged, schools being judged based on academic attainment without looking at the broader educational experience that people are facing. And often the kind of pressures that go with that can be detrimental to learning and to well-being. So I think there is a bit of a tension there when it comes to the practical experience of education systems and schools.
Yes. That chimes in very nicely with a comment here I'm reading. The teaching staff I have met accept inclusivity and diversity and partnership, but they're constantly undermined by politicians who impose rules on how the schools are run and judged. That's a good summary of what we often term as a hyper accountability regime in English schools. Now, in the UK, the Welsh jurisdiction, the Scottish jurisdiction, indeed Northern Ireland jurisdictions are quite different from what we have in England. But there certainly are, there are things that differ considerably. For example, New Zealand was mentioned earlier. Bethan, can I come back to you here, please? Oh, you're on camera now. Are we on camera now? Are we? Oh, indeed, yes, we are. Indeed, we are. We've migrated from Radio 4 to Channel 4. Well done, technicians. Good to see you all. Bethan, can we stay on the theme of international comparisons? Because there's certainly an appetite in our audience to know more, I think, about where you started to talk about New Zealand. We know they've had a radically different approach from top to bottom to what's happened here in the UK broadly. Any other nations that you can refer to here, or tell us more about New Zealand?
Well, I mean, I think when you talk about international responses, something that's useful to look at is historically like what their education systems have been like and what their maybe particular struggles have been. For example, something that we've seen is that in countries that have maybe got more digital infrastructure already in place, like in, you know, countries like New Zealand or the US. In a lot of cases, obviously not all, because there are always, you know, parts of countries that are, you know, more kind of like struggling than others, but where that digital infrastructure has already been in place, or where they've already used a lot of online systems in their teaching already, the transition to online and remote learning has been a lot kind of easier for schools, and particularly for teachers to use if they're already familiar with how to use the technology and things like that. So one of the big challenges I think that's been on kind of like sustaining learning has been getting that, because something that I've been reading about in Vietnam, for example, is that a lot of families don't have access to good kind of technological devices to learn on. A lot of the time it's just a smartphone. If they have that, they don't have maybe access to like a laptop or a family computer, or if they do, maybe they have to share it with siblings because they can't afford to have one for personal use. So that's been a real challenge. So what they've done to overcome that is a lot of teaching and learning and things like that would broadcast on TV channels and radio channels. And this is also something that happened in the US as well, where I think it was PBS or something like that, one of their bigger networks, broadcast a lot of learning in different formats. And I think why that's interesting is it's just shown that that like it is difficult to keep kids learning remotely and online, because obviously of the lack of, you know, physical presence that you've got, and also that it is difficult to reach all of the class population because of the disadvantages that are, you know, prevalent between, you know, students and things like that, that you do need. It's, you know, it's not a one size fits all kind of thing. There will always be you know, a need for different approaches to learning and teaching. So yeah.
Yes, thank you, Julie. On that theme of how technology has been used in many different ways here, and we know, because we both work with colleagues and friends in Malaysia, how the big tech firms have enabled a lot of learning out in remote rural communities. Do you feel there is potential here for something good and positive to emerge in terms of inclusion and equity?
Yes, I think there are possibilities, and I think we found in our project some new opportunities emerging for children to be included through technologies. But one thing for us in the project that seemed important was to think about technologies as both digital and non-digital. So we started to think about other things that schools were doing as technologies. So things like play, things like art. And we were inspired to think about them in this way by reading a book from some time ago by Ivan Illich, who talks about convivial technologies. So we were starting to think about technologies as having a possibility for conviviality. And we saw so many examples of these. And one of them was indeed from Malaysia, whereby play was a central technology used to bring the children in and to engage them.
Thank you. And I must ask you this, because you many colleagues here today know that you are our resident Scandinavian expert. What's been happening up there in Sweden, Norway, and so on?
Well, I don't know about being an expert, but I certainly have a fascination for it. And I've been especially interested to watch Sweden, whose educational decision-making mirrored its decision-making about health more generally. So everything was open, and you know, things have changed slightly since then. But the openness didn't seem to, the open retaining of schools open, and didn't seem to do too much damage by way of increased infection rates. And the schools continued largely as they were for most of the children. So, you know, that's been an interesting experiment to watch.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to do some sort of long-term research as it were, the dust settles, as things, you know, sort of calm down with the, thank goodness, the spread of the vaccinations and so forth, to see what's happened to the Swedish children compared with similar kinds of countries there. Yes, Sweden, for colleagues and friends in Southeast Asia today, in Australasia, Sweden did things very differently, quite iconoclastically, I would say, as it often does in Northern Europe. So thank you for that, Julie. Staying on themes around well-being and what schools can do, Karen, I'm going to ask you about your expert field here for children on the autistic spectrum. We've seen some interesting developments during the pandemic from the learners themselves with autism and their parents and carers. Could you give us an overview of that, please?
Yeah, it's quite mixed. I mean, I think that's really important on an individual level for families and children. The experience of the pandemic for all of us would have varied quite significantly depending on our circumstances, in terms of the sense how isolated we are, our economic circumstances, whether we've got gardens or we haven't got gardens, and so on. We've spoken to a lot of parents and families of children and young people on the spectrum, and we've also spoken to children and young people themselves. And what was quite interesting about the stories that we were told, and I think these are some real lessons for issues that we need to address in the education system for autistic children and young people, was one of the overriding messages we got was that although their children had a greater sense of isolation and felt isolated, the levels of anxiety overall, this was quite a strong message that we got from our research. Levels of anxiety went down. And it has been quite difficult for many teachers and parents to deal with the issue of supporting autistic children and young people back into school afterwards, because their anxiety levels in entering back into school have risen. So that's been a real issue that that needs to be addressed. And it is also an issue that in all the testimonials that we have and all publications and in discussions with virtually every adult that I know on the spectrum, they will report that their overriding emotion from school that they've walked out with, and their memory of their overriding emotions, was around anxiety. And that indicates to me the importance of that we have, that teachers have, that those of us who work with those children and young people, the responsibilities that we have to adjust our interactions, to adjust our communication, to adjust the learning environments that we're creating for those students and young people. And I think there's, you know, the positives that we can take from that. And one of our audience, Jeff Baterson, has raised some of these issues about the need and the importance of focusing on personalized learning approaches and focusing on building on the strengths of children and young people rather than having a kind of deficit focus. And I would just really echo that, how important that is to focus on that. Incidentally, can I just make a quick point about Scandinavia, because I'm Norwegian. And I absolutely agree with all the points that were made about Sweden. It'll be very interesting to see. Now, Norway had a very different approach to Sweden and went into lockdown quicker than England did. And I think it's only in the long term that we'll be able to understand the implications of those different approaches in different countries. But I think the Scandinavian countries, because they are bigger and people are further spread out partly, and they have stronger economic systems, were very well placed to deal with the remote learning and are very well placed to deal with the digital support and having the infrastructure and the systems that were there in terms of digital and remote learning.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask your question, and we'll go around the panel on this, because we've seen globally an increase in home education. We call it elective home education in England, and it looks like some of this might stick, particularly within the communities where children have special educational needs and disabilities. What do we think about that? Is that something we welcome, or something we should be working against, as it were? What do you think? Karen, then Bethan, then Julie on that one, please.
That's quite a loaded question in a way, and a difficult question to answer. I would much prefer we were in a situation where people didn't feel the need for elective home education, where we had an education system that was fit for purpose in terms of meeting the needs of diverse learners. But I recognise for very many families with children on a spectrum, including my nephew, the education system isn't fit for purpose. And therefore, when parents decide to elective home educate, I can understand why they decide to do that. And for many children and young people, that's been a very successful experience for them. But I wouldn't advocate it. We've got a duty to provide a good and strong and education system that's fit for purpose. I think that would be my take on that.
Thank you. Yes, I know it was a loaded question. I thought, okay, go up the gears
That's
a
all
little
right.
bit. Beth, and then Julie on that one, please.
I guess I think to echo what Karen has said, obviously, but I think in terms of like online learning and remote learning and things like that, I mean, it will be very difficult to say. I mean, obviously, we're only kind of seeing and understanding a lot of the effects of what has happened about the pandemic now, and a lot of those have been very different depending on individual circumstances. I mean, a friend of mine who is a teacher shared an experience with me where one of the children that she teaches in her class, who had remained at school during this time, who was quite shy and reserved before the pandemic, that this had actually been very kind of like beneficial for her, because the student in question had then got more confident, and that actually continued when the other students returned to school. So it had kind of helped her come out of her shell a lot more. Obviously, that's just one experience, but I think something to bear in mind with online learning is that obviously it can be useful, and obviously it has been extremely useful for getting some learning through to students throughout the pandemic. But a lot of it, from reading that I've done so far, and obviously I'm still learning so much from it, is that the importance of relationships is key, because where students have had that initial connection to their teachers, they found it more motivating and engaging to keep learning online and sign on when they, personally know their teachers and their students and their friends. Where people haven't had that initial connection, it is more I think likely, or maybe likely is not the word, but it is harder for them to maintain continued engagement when they've not had that initial kind of like social connection and with their teachers and other students. So
well indeed, it comes back to what is the function of schools, and socialization, of course, is right in the foreground there, taking it early years. So Julie, from a sort of inclusion and equity perspective, are there any benefits here from homeschooling as part of a continuum?
Well, I'd like to steal Janet King's point from her, which is that home education is only possible for the middle classes and for people who can afford to, not work outside the home. So, you know, that's an important aspect because it would create further divisions. And like Karen, I wouldn't advocate it. But I think we should be looking to see what we can learn from this period of enforced online learning. And interestingly, in Malaysia, again, one of the schools set the parents up as co-teachers. And that was a really nice formalization of that unspoken expectation that parents had to be teachers on top of being everything else that they are at home. That was one great example. And the other great example was from the vast numbers of teachers who effectively reached out to parents and children in their homes, as Bethan said, reinforcing the importance of relationships. And I think, you know, we really can learn from this situation that we were in, that relationships matter, relationships really matter, and we should allow our teachers the luxury of working on those relationships as well as on the pedagogies and the support for students.
Oh, indeed, Julie. I recall vividly a cameo where one of the inner city Birmingham head teachers who was talking at a seminar that we arranged to look at the impact of the pandemic. And she was describing how she had been going literally door to door for some of the households where English isn't a first language, doing safe and well checks, both for the adults and the children. And that could only reinforce the strength of relationships and trust and bond between the families and the schools for the long term. So this was not something any of us had ever planned for or imagined would be happening, but it is happening out there in the communities.
And sorry, can I come in and echo another comment made by someone way back, so I can't find it, and it's about Ofsted. Ofsted is our English inspection system, and this person said that Ofsted needs, when they come to look at the schools, not to be focusing just on attainment, but on how schools look after children and how well they safeguard.
Well, yes, indeed. And they had a kind of slight sort of armistice, for want of a better word, with schools over the summer. But they're now in this country back with full-fledged standard inspections, I'm afraid. Julie, can I stay with you we have the last 5 minutes here. Let's just think about the adults in the system a little bit here, how the teachers or indeed lecturers are faring. What's your sort of take on the impact of COVID on the adults in the system and their well-being and so forth?
Yeah, well, first of all, the teachers, they've been exceptional. And that's across the globe as far as we've looked at our 6 countries. They've been absolutely exceptional at going the extra mile for students and figuring things out as they've gone on, and producing quite wonderful experiences for children. In higher education, I think the response has been excellent. And I think in these few minutes extra remaining, I'd like to make a plea for examinations to stay off the agenda. We managed in higher education to do without examinations, and we managed in schools to do without examinations, and that's been a great thing. The world hasn't fallen apart. In schools, we've trusted teachers' judgments, and in universities, we've found a different way to assess students with seen exams over 48 hours, and the students have done much, much better work. With these alternatives, we've managed to assess what really matters, what the students and the children and young people have learned, not what they've remembered on a given day. So I think that's one aspect that has been valuable for the adults.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And my tuppence halfpenny worth here, I think that a whole new generation of teachers in English schools have begun to feel secure and confident that they can be trusted to assess the students' work entire, with complete validity and reliability in a way that have been taken away from them the last 10, 12, 15 years. So that is a good thing that's coming out here. Karen.
I think another good thing that's coming out is the partnership work with parents that we've really understood through the pandemic, the real importance of working in partnership. I think from what we've heard from many parents too, that they've got better insight into how their children learn through the pandemic as well. And that's been quite an eye opener to that for them. So I think that partnership between parents and school staff is really, really important. There's a lovely comment here in the chat from Stuart Burney in the music service for Birmingham schools. And he's saying that they've been teaching 38,000 pupils a week through their service. And there's been a massive increase in learning and engagement with parents and carers. I think those kind of positive stories are definitely out there and are really, really important. And I don't want to finish on something negative, but it's important to make this point too, that when we said that many, it's often middle-class parents who've got the money who can afford to home educate. We also have to remember that for autistic pupils, for example, they're twice as likely to be excluded. And what we found was that 76% of parents whose child or young person had been excluded it impacted on their ability to be able to work and on their employment. So sometimes home education is also something that's enforced on people, and we mustn't forget that, because that's a big issue that we need to tackle in society. But I didn't want to finish on the negative, and I know we've got 1 minute left, so I'll hand over back to you.
Well, I'm homing in on your comments about Birmingham Music Service, which is founded on equity and excellence. It's unique, it's wonderful. So Stuart, carry on with the great work out there in our community, please. Bethan, you almost have the last word here. Let's kind of stay fairly positive about, what's been happening out there, because some things have, definitely benefited children and young people.
Well, I think to echo what everything has said, it's been a time obviously of great upheaval and stress for a lot of people, but it's been also a great time for people to work together and to kind of put aside, a lot of, things that have been, difficult, to try and work together to overcome a lot of the challenges that we face. I think one of those things has obviously been the fact that there is a beginning of a new openness to talk about mental health and well-being issues. And also, I just think a great deal more like empathy about the challenges that people have faced, and especially for, parents and teachers that have, for parents who have had to step into the role of kind of like, almost of an educator to try and help their children, learning throughout the pandemic and things like that. I think the recognition that everybody has, obviously gone through a lot and is doing the best they can, and that it means that we can take a good hard look at the education system now that we're kind of starting to come through it and see what we do well, what we can improve on. And like Julie has said about the debts that we owe to the children, because obviously there is a lot of things that need to be given to them in order to make sure that every child has the best opportunity to bring the best out in themselves and their education.
That's a wonderfully positive statement there, Beth, and thank you. And it brings us back to the beginning of our conversation about, I was using language like closing the inequality gaps and so forth, and Julie took us into the concept of debt. I think if there is one enduring benefit here, if the pandemic has shone that light, shone that torch onto the existing inequalities, and we know they've been exacerbated, if that can be picked up through wider social policy, wider education policy, we can see benefits for the long term. I think this is why a number of people, very senior people in the education system, have called for a national commission. Let's all sit down together, forget our identities. Let's just think what's best for the children and young people of the country, in our country, for the next decade, 20 years, and so on. It's very early days. We're still in the middle of the pandemic, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more learning, research. I know that colleagues will be writing papers about this and encapsulating all of the learning that we have been talking about today. So colleagues, it's just gone 2 o'clock. A huge thank you to lots of people here. First of all, to our panel, thank you very much, Julie, Karen, and Bethan, for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, your research. Thank you very much to our organizers in Darrow for pulling the whole event together. And last but not least, thank you to our audience from 38 different countries. There's been some great comments there on the chat line. We need to capture them. They're absolute gold dust. Some we've been able to talk about, 1 or 2 we haven't been able to talk about, but we've captured them. And I'm sure that we'll come back to this subject. It's not a one-off. It's such a profound event. As I said, it was a black swan event, and no doubt we'll be talking about its impact for a long time to come, and the University of Birmingham will be at the center of and leading that research. So to those of you in Southeast Asia and Australasia, good evening. Thank you for staying up. To those in Europe, good afternoon, and enjoy sunny Birmingham if you're in Birmingham, and see you soon. Thank you very much.